So welcome to the first tutorial that I'm going to create on how to create three-dimensional objects from two-dimensional drawings. And we're going to go ahead and get started. The assumption here is that you've already seen the two-dimensional object tutorials, or that you are kind of good enough at modeling where you can quickly come up with some two-dimensional objects. So I'll briefly go over some of those things, but not in as much detail as I did in the previous tutorials. So anytime we want to make a three-dimensional object, in my opinion, it's always best to start with a two-dimensional sketch. So I'll do a bunch of different 3D objects in this first video, but they're almost all going to kind of center around the extrude feature. I will say 70 to 80% of the three-dimensional features that I use to make my three-dimensional objects start and end with the extrude feature. There's a whole bunch of things you can do in this toolbar, but you can make a lot of different shapes just by extruding. So we're going to go ahead and start with our 2D sketch. Remember, we always want to create a sketch. I'm going to pick a plane. I pick the front plane. Notice down in my bottom little timeline, I have a sketch that pops up. It's starting to kind of chart what I am doing in case I ever want to go back in time and make changes. I'm going to go ahead and start with the classic center rectangle, and my goal is going to be to make a cube. So once I make my center point rectangle, and the size of the rectangle right now is irrelevant. If I'm going to make a cube, it's actually have to be a square. So I'm going to go ahead and make this 50 millimeters, and I go ahead and hit the tab button. I make that by 50 millimeters. I hit the enter button. The first big thing to really pay attention to, it's been mentioned in some of the other videos, is you must have a closed sketch if you're going to do anything to it, making it three-dimensional. So how do I know I have a closed sketch? I have that change in color. When I highlight this change in color tells me that I have a closed sketch. I'm going to go ahead and stop my sketch. This is really important. I don't have to stop my sketch to use the extrude feature. If I don't stop my sketch, I'm not going to get added icons down below in this timeline. And if I ever want to go back and make changes, it's going to make things just a little bit harder. So my recommendation is always that you stop two-dimensional sketches before you do anything to make them three-dimensional. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sketch. Every time you stop sketch, it kind of like reorients you a little bit. Not 100% sure why. It doesn't really bother me either way. The next step I'm going to do is go ahead under create. I could hit the default because the extrude icon is the default, but it's also under the create tab, and I'm going to hit extrude. We've seen these types of windows pop up before, and it always kind of gives us a suggestion or like a guide of what we need to do. Anytime you're going to extrude, it has to be a two-dimensional profile. And right now, that profile is this entire rectangle. When I click on the rectangle, again, it changes color, and some new things pop up. First off is an arrow, and that arrow is pointing to the direction that is default of where I'm going to extrude. Very similar to typing in dimensions of how long lines should be. I could type in a dimension of how long I want this to be kind of pulled, extruded. You can almost think like Play-Doh Fun Factory. I'm going to push this rectangle out. How far do I want that to go? Well, if you remember, the sides of my square is 50. If I want this to be a cube, then the height of that cube also needs to be 50. So a couple ways I can do this. I could left click and hold down on that arrow and grab that arrow and push the mouse out. And as you can see, I'm starting to make this three-dimensional cube-like shape. And every time I move it, it seems like the default increments are 5 millimeters. So where before it was kind of hard to make an exact line, in this case, it is somewhat easy to push the mouse to 50 millimeters. If I didn't want to do that, I could tab over to either this little box that pops up, or even under the extrude window that opens up under distance, I could type in 50 millimeters. Anytime you make a first three-dimensional object, down here under operation, you're going to have some options here. I just highlighted that and it says join, cut, intersect, new body, new component. We're not going to get to go through all of these, but I'm trying to get the ones that are the most important. Right now, we don't have any three-dimensional bodies. So new body is kind of what we have to pick. We're going to go ahead and hit OK. And I'm going to kind of highlight the things that have changed. In our bottom kind of timeline, we now have a new icon that represents that extrude step we took. And then over here on the left-hand side, we have a new kind of folder that's opened up, bodies. Technically, it is body because there is only one body. In a similar way, I can turn the light bulb off and that body disappears. I also can pull that light bulb down and see that the sketch is off. If I turn that sketch back on, it kind of shows up. But if I turn the body off, I can still see the sketch that ended up turning into the body. So why do I want that sketch on? Some people might want it on, some people might want it off. I'll turn it off for now. So there's my three-dimensional cube. I want to go back in time and I want to change my cube now. Let's say for some reason I did not want to make that an actual cube. I just wanted to make it like kind of like a prism that was extended out. I can go ahead and if you remember, right click on that icon and go up. Instead of edit sketch, it now says edit feature. And I'm right back to where I was, like I never hit the OK button, and I can actually make this a little bit smaller. I want to highlight here that there's some weird things in Fusion 360. Weird to some people. I actually find it interesting because it's almost how I kind of teach physics. There's really no negative numbers associated with dimensions. You can't have less than zero space. You can't have less than no distance. But you can have directional values. So if I go past to where I started, and I actually, instead of push it, pull it, I see that all those numbers become negative. So that doesn't mean like less than 35 millimeters or 35 millimeters less than zero. That negative sign just symbolizes a direction. So it's just something to look for if you ever have like a default that is not the way you want to go. If you want to pull versus push, you might have to change that to a negative sign. So I'm going to actually make it negative 50. And there is my three-dimensional cube. A couple cool things I can do with the extrude feature. If I wanted to continue to make this a little bit more complex, I can do a couple things. The first thing I can do is actually draw. Instead of on a plane, I can now draw on one of the sides of my rectangle. So I'm going to create a new sketch. And now I have a choice. I can pick any plane I want, but I also can pick the face or the side of my cube. I'm now going to be drawing right on that face. So this time I'm going to put a circle, and I'm going to put a center point circle. I don't really know what I'm making. I'm just kind of doing this. It's easy to find the middle because I have those grid lines, but my mouse also attempts to, and Fusion 360 does, be smart and anticipate what I want to do. So it kind of snaps my cursor to that midpoint. I'm going to go ahead and click once. I'm going to drag my circle out to a diameter, we'll say 25 millimeters. I'm going to hit enter. And now I have this circle, on top of my cube. Stop sketch. And now what I'm going to go ahead and do is show you the two different ways you can kind of use the extrude feature. Let's say I wanted to create like a tab that's going to come out of here, or like this circular cylinder that is going to rise up out of this cube. I'm going to go under extrude, and now I'm going to go ahead and click on the inside of that circle. You can see how my mouse is on the inside, that changes color. And now I've highlighted this circle. I can pull up, and I'm starting to create almost like a little tiny like Lego piece, if you will. Some things that I want to point out. Under operation now, I have a couple options. It defaults to join. There's a big difference between join and new body, and I'm going to try to show you those now. When I hit join, what I want to point out is that it's going to join this new three-dimensional shape to the previously created three-dimensional shape. When I hit OK. So these are now one body made up of two three-dimensional shapes. If I look over under my browser kind of menu file folder that is opened up, I still only have one body. And if I turn that body off, the entire image, or the entire, three-dimensional object goes away. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to edit that feature. And the only change I'm going to make is under the operation, I'm going to go ahead and make it a new body. When I hit OK, it looks the exact same. There was no change made to the shape. But when I go over underneath my browser, I see I now have two bodies. And if I turn one body off, the other body, since the light bulb is on, remains. Now, why is this helpful? Well, you may want to keep some objects separate because you're going to maybe print them up separately and then try to assemble them. So it's kind of nice to have those two separate bodies, and you can model it all at once, but then you can print it up in separate parts. That actually can kind of come back and hurt you a little bit later if your goal was to print it up all at once and you have a bunch of different bodies. It's a little bit harder to export that file correctly. So just keep that in mind. It's rare that we keep things as separate bodies. A lot of times we'll have our students who have like 5 or 6 bodies and they don't realize it, and then we have to go back and figure out a way to kind of combine them all. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to go ahead and edit that feature, and I am going to make it say join. So I have this cool Lego piece, and I'm actually thinking about a Lego I just helped my daughter build. There's a piece that looked like this, but then there was a hole in the middle. There was a hole that ran kind of like from side to side and allowed you to like insert a rod. So we're going to go ahead and do that next. Again, I'm going to go under create, sketch. I'm going to pick a center point circle. And this time I'm going to pick the side plane. It doesn't really matter which side plane I pick right now because everything's so symmetrical. It's kind of like flipped it. That's not a big deal at all. If I wanted to, though, I could like reorient myself using my view cube so that I'm kind of in this the way I was oriented before. I'm going to go ahead and find that center point, and I'm going to go ahead and make this the same 25 millimeters. Excuse me. I now have stopped my sketch again. If you look at the bottom of the toolbar, you look at this timeline, I have all of these steps taken. So if I ever wanted to kind of go back in time and make changes, I could by moving this little marker. And if I ever want to just kind of like highlight to somebody, hey, here are the steps I took, I can do that by kind of going back in time and then moving slowly up. Now that I have this circle, I'm going to go ahead and under create. I'm still using just the extrude feature. I'm going to pick that circle. The difference is instead of coming out and making it another kind of like Lego piece that helps you snap into another, I'm going to go ahead and push this into that part. And immediately it resets the operation to the word cut. So in this case, we're not going to create a 3D object. We're actually going to remove three-dimensional space. And there's a couple ways I can do this. If I kind of rotate my view and move the part around, I can just drag this and make sure that it is all the way through the part. And you can see that that kind of reddish color shows you where you are at, or a preview of where you're at. And I can also think that, hey, negative 85 millimeters is greater than 50 millimeters in the negative direction, so I am through it. But now I have some other options. Under extent, I can either have distance highlighted, and that's where I can type in a distance or use the arrow to pull and push. But if I pull that menu down, I have some other options. And if I do all, it's going to make sure that the cut takes place throughout all of that object. Once you do all, notice that you don't have anywhere to type in a dimension, but you have the word all here. So when I go ahead and hit OK, from this view, you really can't tell, but as soon as I start to turn the view cube, you can see that I have now hollowed out in the shape of that cylinder my fictional Lego piece here. So those are the really important aspects of the extrude feature. I can not only take two-dimensional objects and kind of extend them out, but I can take a two-dimensional shape and I can make that a kind of like void or a hollow space in an object. I don't have to go all the way through. Let's say I just wanted that to go halfway through. I wanted that to just be kind of like a little indent, if you will. I'm going to go ahead and edit my feature. And instead of all, I'm going to make that distance, and I can figure out how far I want that. Let's say I only wanted it to go halfway through, and that would be negative 25. When I hit enter, I can see that I have this kind of void on one side, but on the other, it is still solid. All right, that is the first introduction video, kind of how to make rudimentary 3D shapes using just the extrude feature.